Hi, this is part 2 of the video tutorial series, What is the Magellan course? In this tutorial, we are going to look at dialectical reasoning through the work of Gebser and his notion of the structures of consciousness. In our last tutorial, we talked about the Magellan course being interested in crossing a frontier. And that frontier was between the current state, where our reasoning is dialectical, has a dialectical dynamic, into a potential situation which is not dialectical, but represents a new way of thinking that is not dialectical. And so I think it is important to understand the evolution of dialectical reasoning, how it came to be, what exactly characterizes and accounts for dialectical reasoning, before we go on to investigate the possibility of new types of consciousness and new structures of reasoning that do not operate dialectically. So we're going to look at this today in terms of Gebser's structures of consciousness and Gebser's work, The Ever-Present Origin. And in the subsequent videos, part 3, we'll look at dialectical reasoning through developmental theory. And in part 4, we'll look at dialectical reasoning through the history of philosophy. But for today, we are going to look at dialectical reasoning through Gebser's work from The Ever-Present Origin, his book, The Ever-Present Origin, and this notion of the evolution of the structures of consciousness. So I hope you enjoy this tutorial. Gebser saw the evolution of human consciousness as proceeding through great epochal shifts, and he uses that term epic. So if we imagine 3 waves or 3 great epochal shifts, epochs of consciousness. And the way he saw these epochs arising were through phases. So each epoch would have a phase, and the phases would go from latent, or the early phase, to efficient phase, the height of the maturity of the structure of consciousness, to a deficient phase. So we can think of this epoch here, between these 2 points, as the epoch we are in, this epoch here as the epoch that came before. And so this, just before we start moving into our epoch, our structure of consciousness today, we would have come from the deficient stage of the previous epoch. And moving out of our structure of consciousness, developing toward the new, we'll see we're moving into a new latent stage of the new structure of consciousness. Now, each of these structures of consciousness can be identified by the types of reasoning that are evident through works of art, through philosophy, through language, through different cultural traditions and structures. And so what we're going to look at today is the current structure of consciousness. Over the last 2,000 years is called the mental structure. The previous structure of consciousness, Gebser called the mythic structure, not to be confused with the mythic level of development within the mental structure, and the upcoming or the new structure of consciousness Gebser called integral. Again, not to be confused with the term integral in terms of developmental theory within the mental structure. And we will look at developmental theory within the mental structure in the next video. So each of these epochs, each of the structures of consciousness, have a three-phase kind of evolutionary momentum. Within the mental structure of consciousness that we are in now, the latent form of reasoning Gebser called oceanic. The efficient form of reasoning Gebser called pyramidal, and we'll see why. And the deficient form of reason Gebser called perspectival. And in general, Gebser left the detail of the integral structure blank, and so this is the territory where we're doing hypothetical work. We're trying to fill in the blanks in this territory in the Magellan course, but be consistent with some of the processes that Gebser described. Now, another thing in terms of what we're looking at are these three types of reasoning build up to what we understand as dialectical reasoning. So the movement from the oceanic to the pyramidal to the perspectival is a development of dialectical reasoning through history. Prior to this phase, the mythic was not yet dialectical. And in fact, even oceanic reasoning is not yet dialectical. And so our hypothesis, and this would be consistent with Gebser, is that beyond the epoch of the mental structure of consciousness, the types of reasoning would be no longer dialectical. So that's the hypothesis, that we go from the not yet dialectical epoch through this process of the development of dialectical reasoning within this evolutionary epoch to a shift, an evolutionary shift to a new structure of consciousness, the integral structure of consciousness, where it is no longer dialectical. And that would be the reasoning behind the Magellan course trying to look into this hypothetical territory, to give it more detail the way Gebser has detailed the reasoning structures as they developed through the mental epoch. Okay, so that's basically the grand overview. So what we can do is parse out and look at oceanic thinking or oceanic reasoning. Oceanic reasoning was not quite yet dialectical, and it proceeds from the mythic. And Gebser made these distinctions. The mythic he called two-dimensional. And the characteristic of the mythical, this would be the mythic, stepping back here, the characteristic of the mythical is that there was always a return, never a progression, never a progression. And so we see this in mythic cultures today are mythical systems. So you have cycles, seasonal cycles, where there's spring, there's summer, there's fall, there's winter, and there's spring. So there's always a return, a mandala-like mentality. There's the temporix, or the time frame, is always cyclical or periodic. Zeus flew around the heavens in a diurnal pattern. There's tales of birth, death, and rebirth in cyclical patterns, like the tale of the phoenix. So the mythic had this two-dimensional character to it. And the problem with the mythic is that it represented in its deficient stage, just before the new epic, the problem with the mythic is that it became, it was completely closed, that all the systems had been completely closed within this endless cycle of return. So the cultural structures, the cultural systems, the power structures, the kinds of justifications humans used for moral and ethic jurisprudence, they all ended up having no ability to get beyond this closure. This is the way things are. They will always be the same. The illusion that things change is defeated by the fact that things always return. So Gebser talked about this problem with closure of the system that created the impetus or the dynamics for the mythic type of reasoning, this two-dimensional reasoning, to move into a new type of reasoning. And the first indication of that Gebser calls oceanic reasoning. So if we look at oceanic reasoning, again, just to back up, mythic reasoning had this polar structure. So if this was the beginning, you reason, you come back, there's always a return. And that represented closure in the mythic style of reasoning. It's two-dimensional, so you have two-dimensional with a closure. And Gebser called this polar reasoning. And this closure represented an evolutionary dynamics to move toward new types of reasoning. So we get to oceanic reasoning, which Gebser called oceanic because it has wave-like movements that have indications of progression, but that eventually are recursive and also return the way the polar reasoning does. But in this, Gebser sees the beginning of a movement away from polar reasoning. And so, for example, in oceanic reasoning, he uses a quote from Heraclitus. And the quote goes, soul's death becomes water. Water death becomes earth. So there's a sense that there's a progression from one term to the next, and then a progression to another term. This is the wave-like structure of oceanic. But then the way this quote ends is from earth water from water souls. And so you see, despite this progression, there's a re-looping back to origin. And so this is oceanic thinking as the latent precursor of dialectical thinking for the efficient phase of the mental structure of consciousness. And so we go from mythic, which has got this closed, two-dimensional but closed reasoning cycle, to oceanic, which gives us some indication of this progression to other terms, relating the beginning term to other terms, but with the completion of the thought or argument still going back to close on the origin. Still has this mandala-like quality. So that's why he calls oceanic thinking latent. It shows signs of moving from polar reasoning in the mythic structure, but it's not quite yet as mature a dialectical process as the next phase that Gebser identifies in the mental structure, the development of the mental structure of consciousness into the efficient phase. He calls that thinking pyramidal. So we go from the polar reasoning of a mythic structure to the transitional phase, oceanic, in its wave-like structure, to the efficient phase, the pyramidal, which today we recognize as dialectical thinking, and certainly Gebser did also. So now we'll turn to the efficient phase of the mental structure, and that's pyramidal thinking. Okay, so we are going from the mythic to oceanic, which is the first indication of dialectical thinking, to pyramidal thinking. Gebser called the mythic two-dimensional with its closure, and he called pyramidal three-dimensional. And the reason why is that pyramidal thinking, we won't be surprised, looks like this, can be illustrated like this. You have A, you have not A, and then you have a progression to a higher synthesis. So here's the originary term. It is contrasted with its opposite, so at the far end. So if this is summer, this would be winter. And instead of having a completion in this argument back to summer, this tension, this gap, is held open in lieu of the search for a higher synthesis. In this higher synthesis, Gebser talked about as the third term, or the tertium. And this pyramidal or triangular structure is what gives this type of reasoning the label pyramidal. So now the interesting thing is that pyramidal thinking in the term dialectic comes from Plato, and he uses the term diaresis. And what diaresis means is separation. And it refers to the ability for the mind to hold this gap, this tension in this gap between antinomies or opposites in order to force a higher synthesis, in order to gain a higher synthesis. And so you see some of this in Plato, in Socrates, the way Socrates would tease out the paradoxes and force people to move to a higher level of thinking. And this paved the way for all kinds of evolutionary advances in human history. But this notion of diaresis, of being able to hold these antinomies as opposites at the end of a spectrum, was a significant difference than what the mythic mind could do. The mythic mind would always see these categories as turning over on themselves in a mandala-like fashion and just recapitulating themselves. What we then see in terms of what dialectical reasoning amounts to after 2,000 years of dialectical reasoning is that you have this pyramidal thought that leads to a higher synthesis, which then finds its antithesis, leads to a higher level synthesis. And after 2,000 years, the whole system has created this very progressive, or progression, this notion of reasoning as progress or progression. And Gebser was very careful and very painstaken to note that this concept of progress or progression is a product of the dialectical style of reasoning of the mental structure of consciousness. And so when he talks about the evolution of the structures of consciousness, he does not mean to imply or to incorporate this mental structure of progression onto the notion of evolution. This is very important point in reading Gebser, that our tendency to see evolutionary processes as progressive is merely a condition of the mental structure of consciousness. And so this is another kind of view that is conditional to and dependent upon the mental structure epoch of consciousness. And so for Gebser, because he was moving beyond that conditioned mindset, he saw evolutionary change as just that, epochal shift, but not necessarily progressive, and that the notion of progression is imputed on epochal shift by the mental structure of consciousness because of the dialectical style of reasoning, which over 2,000 years sees this constant progression. In analogous to the way the mythic structure of consciousness saw everything as complete iteration and return, the mental structure of consciousness sees everything as increasingly progressing. And so we hear of the concept of complexification, that systems and evolution complexifies over time. And this is merely a view of the mental structure in its type of reasoning, which gives us this progressive understanding of apocal shift. So Gebser really worked hard at making these kinds of distinctions so people could understand that the way we view evolution is a byproduct of the epoch that we are in. So without a doubt, there's this epochal shift, but it only appears as a progressive complexification, a continual progression and complexification because of the dynamics, the dialectical dynamics of the mental structure. And so this pyramidal type of thinking, with its positive consequences, results, and some of its own limitations, represents the efficient phase of the mental structure of consciousness and really the epoch we've been in for the last 2,000 years. Now the question we are in the pyramidal or efficient stage phase of the mental structure. And even Gebser could see that this had already begun to become deficient. Or we could say it had started to exhaust its useful evolutionary usefulness as it moved into what he called the deficient stage, and he associates that with his term for that is perspectival. Now this is very interesting because if you're familiar with integral theory or Aqual theory, then the whole notion of perspectivalism and integral methodological pluralism and multi-perspectivalism is touted as the pinnacle of rational development. But for the very same reasons that Gebser saw what perspectival reasoning was, he sees that he codifies this as the deficient stage of the mental structure. So there's actually a complete disconnect between Aqual theory and Gebser's notion of the perspectival phase. Gebser saw the perspectival phase of reasoning in the mental structure as being deficient. So this is not a small point if you are a scholar of integral theory. It's Aqual version of integral theory. So why did Gebser see perspectivalism as being deficient? Well, it's quite, Gebser himself is quite complicated to read, but what I can summarize for you is that after 2,000 years of this progressive movement to find the third term, there are three major reasons why the pinnacle of this, which is perspectivalism, is become deficient. And number one is that the perspectivalism is developed because of 2,000 years of meta-theoretical division. So you have higher and higher, the third term represents higher and higher levels of integration, but the situation is so complexified And so driven by this notion of progress and higher levels, that there are no longer any solutions. Okay. The solutions, the inquiries become more and more abstract, more and more meta-theoretical, more and more complexified. They can't solve any, it doesn't solve any more problems. So in a sense, it represents a closure. So the meta frames that are required, these are not Gebser's terms, itself represents a kind of closure, because you're constantly moving to more and more complex, higher abstract versions of the inquiry. And so that's why he called this phase deficient. The second reason is because the metaframes, these are not his terms, this is a synopsis, they exit their own domain, the domain of inquiry. So, for example, in Hargen's and Zimmerman's book, Integral Ecology, it's a compendium of hundreds of different approaches to ecology, parsed out based upon altitude, this notion of altitude, worldview, the who, the what, the where. It makes all these perspectival distinctions. But when you read the book Integral Ecology, it does not do ecology. Okay? It does meta-theory. And so the problem with perspectivalism is that it creates its own map territory confusion. The map becomes so complex, and you're so concerned with the map and its ever-increasing complexity, that you really kind of lost touch with being. And this is really the critique that Gebser has with perspectivalism, and that is that all these progressive shifts in the pyramidal structure of reasoning after 2,000 years has created a idea of transcendence as truth, and has completely lost touch, has made a gap, this gap that's being held between has been iterated over and over and over again. So now there's this complete gap between this transcendent abstraction and what he would call being or origin. And that perspectivalism and meta-theory can no longer get at immanence and the basic fundamental ground of being. So this is really the biggest critique about perspectivalism, that it starts to be distracted by its own abstractions, and it no longer what Gebser coins the term, no longer awares the truth in being. And so what was once in the pyramidal form efficient and evolutionarily advantageous has become in the perspectival form deficient. And the only place I see this in Ackwall theory is when Wilbur says that Ackwall is a map of the prison. And this really would resonate with Gebser, that perspectivalism is a great map, but it's a map of the prison. And the prison has been generated by dialectical mind. The prison is nothing but the reified abstractions of dialectical mind. And so this represents what Gebser would call the deficient phase of the mental structure of consciousness, which is this hyper-complexified dialectical reasoning. So we've moved from the mythic and its polar reasoning, which is not yet dialectic, to the mental structure of consciousness in its three phases: the latent phase, and the latent phase, which is oceanic reasoning; the efficient phase, which is pyramidal; and the deficient phase, which is perspectival. And so now we want to look at what is the latent phase of the new structure. One of the types of reasoning that Gebser sees as a candidate, we'll just call it a candidate for this latent phase of the new structure, he called paradoxical reasoning. And paradoxical reasoning has this, can be described as being able to hold this gap of A and not A, let's say. So it can still hold this gap. So in that sense, it retains some of the experience of diaresis or separation. But what it does is it resists the synthetic move. Or it resists the synthetic or the transcendent or abstraction, the higher abstraction move. And that's why he calls it paradoxical, because it kind of rests in this paradoxical territory, just as that, without the synthetic move. And what Gebser saw, and I think it's consistent with what we see today, the reason why this alternative comes up is because the people that are starting to, in the history of what Gebser was looking at, starting to reason in a more paradoxical style, are all people related to either spirituality. So, for example, the Buddhist scholastics, or that have some kind of re-enchantment with being, as for example, Heidegger, or are interested in theology or religion. And so you have the beginning of the Western process philosophers. And so this commonality between them is that they were looking outside the mind or beyond the mind to ground truth in being. And in that being, in that experience of being, they found the ability to hold the mind stable in this paradoxical state. And so paradoxical reasoning is a transitional phase that Gebser saw associated with a movement that was not toward the deficient phase of the mental structure, but he saw it as a transitional phase. He doesn't quite tag it as the latent phase of the new structure, but he does identify paradoxical reasoning as in a category of its own and transitional between dialectical reasoning. It has this ability to hold this paradox, but resisting this tendency to make the higher synthetic move creates a completely different view. And so that is an important phase to consider as we continue our inquiry in the Magellan course.